You know, in politics, what's said behind closed doors, well, it almost never stays there. We're gonna dive into two pretty recent text message scandals, one from each side of the aisle. But here's the thing, this isn't really about the juicy, shocking texts themselves. No, it's about what the source material claims the reactions to these texts tell us about a really deep, maybe even dangerous, divide in American politics.
So here's the game plan. First up, we'll get into why we're all so fascinated by these leaked messages to begin with. Then we'll look at a Republican scandal and how the party handled it. After that, we'll jump to a Democratic scandal and see a totally different reaction. And to wrap it all up, we'll connect the dots and see how the source uses these two stories to make a pretty big claim about where the country is headed.
Okay, so let's start with this. What is it about leaked texts that just grabs our attention? I mean, we can't look away, right? The source puts it pretty simply. When people are texting, they think it's private. They let their guard down. So when those messages leak, it feels like we're getting this raw, unfiltered peek behind the curtain into what these powerful people actually believe. And the source material really leans into this. It actually compares a text scandal to a sex tape, something that's just irresistible. The whole idea is that we're drawn to it because it feels forbidden, like we're seeing something we absolutely were not supposed to see. But here's the twist, and this is the most important part according to the source. The shocking words in the texts, that's not the main event. The real story, the real insight, comes from what happens next. It's all about how the political machine on each side kicks into gear when one of their own gets caught. All right, let's get into the first case study. This one centers on a leaked group chat, and the people in it were all part of a young Republicans group. And the language they were using, wow, it was, by pretty much any standard, really offensive. The source lays out the specific quotes from this chat, and we're talking about racial references, a so-called joke about the gas chamber, and throwing around slurs. Now, this is where it gets interesting, according to the source. The really important part of the story isn't just the texts, it's the reaction from inside the Republican Party. And that reaction was apparently super fast and super strong. The source points out that leaders, everybody from the Young Republican National Board, all the way up to a sitting congressman, they didn't make excuses. They came out and condemned it using the strongest language possible. So what's the source's take on this? Why the quick condemnation? It's framed as an act of gatekeeping. The argument goes like this. The Republican leadership is essentially policing its own side. They're drawing a line in the sand about what you can and can't say, all to keep up a certain public image. Maybe, the source suggests, they're even playing by rules set by their political opponents. Okay, now for part two. The source sets this up as a complete contrast to what we just saw. This scandal is about Jay Jones, who was a big-name Democrat in Virginia, and he was even running for Attorney General when this all went down. And this time, the leaked texts weren't about slurs or bad jokes. No, this was about straight-up explicit violence. The source gives us the direct quote from Jones, where he's apparently calling for the murder of a Republican official named Todd Gilbert, and then calls Gilbert's own kids little fascists. And the source makes a big deal of this. It apparently wasn't just some heat-of-the-moment comment. When another person in the chat pushed back, asking if he was serious, Jones didn't back down at all. Instead, he's quoted as doubling down on it, basically confirming, yep, I meant it. Okay, let's pause for a second. We've got two scandals. One is about ugly slurs, the other is about calls for murder. So the huge question the source is asking is, how did the reactions from each party stack up against each other? This really lays out the whole comparison from the source, side by side. You see it right there. For the Republican scandal, you had offensive language that was met with immediate condemnation. But for the Democratic scandal, you had calls for violence that were allegedly met with defense, deflection, and just silence from the party. And this comparison is what leads us to the source's main point. The claim is that the two parties are playing completely different games. The argument is that one party spends its time policing language and worrying about appearances. The other party, it's focused on one thing, protecting its own people to hold on to power no matter what they've done. The source then brings out some specific examples to try and prove this point. It points to then House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, who apparently defended Jones. It brings up Abigail Spanberger, a congressional candidate who, when asked about the text in a debate, just stayed silent. And it mentions Virginia's Black Caucus defending Jones, which the source chalks up to what it calls tribal loyalty. So what's the end game here? Where does all this lead? Well, this whole analysis, which comes from a Tucker Carlson segment, uses these two scandals as a launchpad for a much, much bigger argument about where American politics is heading. And this is where we get to the final big picture takeaways from the source. The argument boils down to this. The Democratic Party has become radicalized, focused only on power. Meanwhile, Republican leadership is weak, too busy policing its own side to please its opponents. The result? An unbridgeable divide. A gap so big as heading towards something like a civil war. And the source argues the real fight isn't even Democrat versus Republican anymore. It's against the whole entrenched system, the deep state. So why should you care about any of this? Well, according to the source, this isn't just about political gossip. It's a symptom of something much bigger, a fundamental shift. The idea is that these scandals aren't just isolated incidents. They're like little pieces of evidence that show we're in a political reality where the two sides aren't even playing the same game anymore. And that leaves us with the final, pretty provocative question that the source puts on the table. If one side is, as they claim, policing bad jokes, while the other is tolerating calls for murder, does that mean the gap between them, the gap in their values and what they're trying to achieve, has just gotten too wide to ever fix? Is it truly unbridgeable? That's the thought this analysis wants you to wrestle with.